Hi, Kerry.
Hello there, Sarah. Hello, everyone, and thanks for coming. I can see quite a few familiar faces, so thanks for coming. Excited to be here, nervous to be here, and looking forward to having our own conversation, Sarah.
Yeah. My memory of what happened was I remember meeting you during the development phase of the project when you came up to Dunsop Bridge and thinking, wow, this is exciting. This is all very new, and I'm a boring scientist, and it's really quite, really high energy. And so I was really excited when Kathy explained, Kathy's our program manager, that the Summit project that I look after part of, the peat restoration part of, Kerry, who I'd only met once, I think, at that time, was going to be almost like my artist alongside me. It's really exciting, with the role of, unenviable role of turning my blah, blah, blah jargonistic way of getting into far too much scientific detail about peat restoration, and kind of being an interpreter beside me to allow normal people to know what we're doing and why.
I've got memories of when we first met as well. But I mean, for me, I was coming in almost like ground zero, as in not knowing anything about peat whatsoever, and sort of having this commission, which was to kind of sort of spread the word about the value of peat to people who live around Pendle Hill, and not necessarily people who go up Pendle Hill. So maybe people that have never been to a peat bog or a peat landscape at all, and are the people that live around Pendle Hill are very sort of it's very diverse. People from different backgrounds. We have a large Pakistani heritage background on the side that in situ is based in, so that clearly had to be taken into account. And then the other side, the northern side, where Clitheroe is much more sort of white British, and Lancashire. So we're kind of like thinking about how to communicate the values of peat. But for me, I had to learn about peat. So Sarah was also my teacher. And up until really meeting and talking to Sarah, I'd never realised that this brown earth on the top of Pendle Hill was actually bare peat that was being eroded by the wind and by the rain. For me, and through my eyes, it was just what Pendle Hill landscape is at the top. There's a lot of white pebbly stones on top of Pendle Hill, and people use the stones to write messages or their names in this peat, which I thought was quite endearing, because it becomes like, almost like a chalkboard on the top where people are leaving these messages. And then I learned that actually this is the very thing that needs to be covered up, not the words, but the bare peat, to stop it eroding. And I learned why it was important to stop it. And of course, then you've also got this thing happening whereby you've got a cultural tradition that has sort of manifest itself on top of the hill, that also needs to be, will be disrupted. People will lose that kind of chalkboard and lose that tradition of being able to make these marks on top of the hill. So that was another thing that we talked about, sort of how people connect who are going up onto the hill, how they're connecting with that current landscape, and how they might sort of feel about that landscape changing.
There are two maps here. The one on the left shows where peatlands are in the UK. The one on the right shows the Bowland AONB, and in the bottom right corner you can see where Pendle Hill is, and you can see the peat on Pendle Hill. In this, much better in this, the purple hash is the area that we're looking at. Kerry was talking about bare peat. Here we're looking at bare peat. You can see quite a bit of the little stones she was talking about as well, and patches of some vegetation, but then lots of overhanging vegetation, and under that is where the peat is being eroded from. And also, if you look at this picture, it's a bit bonkers. One of my colleagues is standing in a gully, and the erosion, as you can see she's standing at the base of the peat, and that she's So yeah, 1.5 meters of peat has been eroded in these channels coming off, and that down into the local streams and rivers, producing sediment in those streams and rivers, affecting our drinking water quality, speeding up the speed of water off the hill during rainstorms, and causing a lot of problems, and drying out the peat as it goes. So what we have done, next one is just a really quick, this is a during picture. So what we've got here, this is on Pendle. So the sides of that deep gully have been opened out, and that change in the angle means that you don't get as much erosion, and it allows that much more shallow angle allows us to revegetate those sides, and also put blocks across the bottom of the gullies to slow the flow of water. So there's lots of things that happen during the peat restoration process, and it makes, I see people's eyes glaze over when we're talking about it. So this is why we're working together. And this is another, I was talking about slowing the flow. So here we've got a gully where the sides have been opened out, and you can see these kind of browny orangey sausage shapes. These are called coir logs. They are made from the husks of coconut. Sometimes we use a similar thing which is made from sheep's fleece, and they're a bit like tea strainers. They slow down the rate of the water flow, but they also, because they slow the rate of water flow, the peat sediment drops out of the water and redeposits behind these coir logs. Remember the word coir logs, and remember what they look like, because I think Kerry might come back to them. And the next one is just to give you an idea. So this is 12 months on from the previous shot in exactly the same place. So you can see the water is slowing down. There's areas of pools and stiller water, and the vegetation is starting to come back through. So, and what's happening as the water sits in those areas, it's sinking back down into the peat and re-wetting the peat, which means that the peat mosses can start to grow again. So yeah, that's a really quick whistle-stop tour of what Kerry and I were talking about when we first went up onto the hill, and this idea of restitching the landscape and thinking of the vegetation as kind of the canvas, and rips and gashes in the canvas that we were talking about. We ended up talking quite a lot about textiles and mending, didn't we, Kerry? I seem to remember.
We did.
So one of the other things that we did, I think the second time we went up, was Kerry was really interested in investigating the peat itself. So here we did some peat cores. Peat accumulates at 1 millimeter a year. So a meter of peat represents 1,000 years of peat creation, and the peat is deposited as partly decomposed. Well, it's partly decomposed vegetation, normally based around sphagnum mosses, and because up there it's cold, it's acidic, and down below in the peat there's no oxygen, so things don't decompose. So you get this amorphous mass column of peat. So you can dig down in, and this has got this coring machine. You kind of turn it around. It's like a corkscrew going down in and in and in and in, and then this the blade captures 50 centimeters depth, and we use the very technical drain pipe here to lay it down. So then you can lay down, you're actually laying down from the present day back to, well, I think we did 3 meters. So yeah. 3,000 years worth of vegetation and stuff nobody else on the planet has ever seen apart from us. Well, we were the first people to see that little bit. but also preserved in the peat, you've got all the pollen grains. So as a paleobotanist would be really interested in separating out those microscopic pollen grains, which would tell you what species of plants and trees were growing in the Pendle area at any point over the last 3,000 years. So it's, the more you get into it, it's like, wow, this is really interesting. And I'm sure everyone's kind of heard of the, you know, the bog man and peat bog, the man in the marsh, peat marsh, you know, these people who were sacrificed and dropped in the bog, and their bodies are preserved to this day.
I was also thinking much about not just what was happening on the top of the hill, but people who live around the bottom and people's lives, and what is it that we're all kind of connected to, because we're not all connected to peat, but we are all connected to food. And I love food, and I love sort of reading about, you know, sort of politics of food, where food comes from, and often food can have very strong kind of local identity. And for a long time, I'd kind of liked this idea of creating a pie or a pudding or a cake that was in some way related to Pendle or Briarfield, where it's cheese based, much like a Dundee cake from Dundee or a Bakewell tart from Bakewell, so that the food product itself is absolutely linked to the place, and the place to the product. And so this notion of maybe creating something around food, connected with food named after places, alliteration, I love alliteration. So the PPP, the Pendle Peat Pie, and it just felt like it could work, and it felt like it could also be something that is about fusion. And when we're talking about the messages, I think, you know, Sarah just said, I mean, I don't think she's a boring scientist at all. She's quite the opposite. But Sarah was just saying, like, some people's eyes glaze over when you start to talk about, you know, things like 3% of the globe is covered with peat bog and blah blah. And it's true. People don't always want the statistics. And I think one of the things that I was interested in is just raising awareness that there is this stuff called peat on top of the hill, because I think there's an awful lot of work that needs to be done for us, not only to restore and repair peat, but also to stop peat being extracted. And so for me, one of the sort of end goals is to see, not to see any more peat in garden centres or places like B&Q, because that, if it's not being extracted here in the UK, it will be being extracted from somewhere else. And it doesn't matter where your peat bog is, where your peat is, as soon as it's extracted, it releases carbon dioxide and methane back into the atmosphere, which is no good for any of us, because we're in a time of climate crisis and we really need to be taking account of all of this. Everyone was kind of keen on this idea of a peat pie. So we decided that's what we'd go for. Now, I'm not a cook, I'm not a chef, I know what I like to eat, but I wanted to work with somebody local who was a cook, and in situ often has events, and we'd been working with this guy who came and fed us at our events and our visitors, called Andrew Dean, and I asked him if he'd be interested in working with me to develop a peat pie. And he was thrilled, and so the two of us then worked together to develop a Pendle peat pie, and we worked on a Pendle peat pud as well, and then we had a tasting. So we spoke about the restoration process and how could we possibly get that sort of into a pie, and there were a few things that were specifically important to me, and one of them was obviously the peat, the deep peat. The other one was the coir logs. The other one was the layer of vegetation that Sarah and her team are putting back onto the peat to hold it in place. And the other one was the waterloggedness, the fact that peat needs to be wet. So those were kind of the things we were looking at, and we were looking at sweets and savoury. So Andrew went off and he had a play around with some different ideas. And he came back, and a few of us in situ tried the pie, and we decided to go savoury because savoury somehow feels more Lancashire, and we could get more fusion in a savoury as well. The first outing of the pies was at the Peat Symposium, and here is Andrew and myself dishing out the peat. And the peat pie, which is served with peas, which is very traditional to Lancashire. Peat pie, very importantly, is a fusion of Asian, Pakistani, and also just sort of traditional Lancashire. And what the pie is chips and curry. It's a layer of dal, brown lentil dal, and Andrew got this recipe for the dal from his good friend, who is a Pakistani woman who works at a cafe that he works at. And then within this, he places chips. So there's chips within the dal. Now the dal is representing the peat. The chips are representing the coir logs that are holding back the peat. And then on top of that, there is a layer of creamed spinach, which is creamed with tofu, because the pie is also a vegan pie, because we thought it would be interesting to have a vegan pie. And then it's topped with pastry. And then on top of that, there is a miso gel with spinach in it. So that also is kind of like the water pooling on top of the pie. So we took it to Clitheroe Food Market for people to taste and comment on. We felt pretty convinced that this was the right pie. It was getting great feedback. The only kind of criticism we were getting was either there's too much chilli in it or there's not enough chilli in it. But otherwise, people were saying it tastes great, it's wholesome, it feels like Lancashire. They were surprised that it was vegan. They didn't even, a lot of people didn't even think that it was a vegetarian pie. So we felt that it was kind of cutting across that as well. So there was lots of people wanting to eat the pie, whether they were vegan or vegetarian or meat eaters. We really wanted the pie to get out beyond in situ, beyond the Pendle Hill Landscape Partnership, and get it into as many eateries as we possibly could around the hill. So we needed a producer of the pie, and we also needed the outlets. So we needed the cafes, we needed the bars, the pubs, the chip shops. We needed all of these guys to kind of buy in and go for the pie, say, yes, we'll do this. And we managed to find a couple of producers, and the one that we were going with was Pie Mezzanine, who are based in Blackburn. And they did a few samples of the pie that we could taste. So this is their version of the pie. And they serve pies at schools as part of school dinners. They do the football matches. And they also have independent cafes and shops that they send their pies to. But obviously that's kind of the stage we got to in February. And then March happened, and then we go into lockdown. So everything with the pie has kind of stopped. And one of the impacts, of course, has been that one of the sectors really badly hit by the pandemic and the COVID-19 lockdown and restrictions has been the hospitality area. So all of the places where we were going to have the pie weren't able to be open. Some of them still aren't open yet. And we're just kind of on hold at the moment.
I actually went up with some friends at the end of January. Was it end of January, February? It was after the really bad rainfall that we'd had. Those rainfall events that we're getting, kind of getting into a little bit about climate change, are a lot more much more intense rainfall events than we have been having up until the recent past. And what's actually happened with some of the peat restoration work that we've done on the hill, where we'd put in heat buns across those wide gullies that I showed you pictures of, and the intensity of those storms that we had was it early February? blown through those dams, and that I've never seen that happen before. The timber dams that we put in place are all still there and fine, but the lower peat-based blocks have actually been pushed out by the force of the water. So and quite a lot, what we do on the bare peat is cover it with a blanket of heather and moss brash, and the force of the storm had actually washed all that away. So it wasn't my happiest visit, I have to say, and just shows that the process of peat restoration is not you go, you do it, you fixed it, you move somewhere else. It's an iterative process that has that other things. It's called adaptive management, that you have to keep looking, you have to keep adapting, you have to keep tweaking. So what we're hoping to do this coming season is we've got some climate change contingency money, and we're going to shore up and change the specification, which we're hoping will climate proof, but increase the resilience of the blocks that we're putting in. But the bits where that hadn't happened, and we'd been working, Kerry and I did a couple of days where we were encouraging people up the hill to come and actually take part in the peat restoration work itself, and by bringing us plants and bringing plants up the hill.
Sarah was up with going to be up with volunteers on top of the hill planting cotton grass, and I suggested, well, why don't we sort of hand out cotton grass at the bottom of the hill so people can take it up, give it to you and the volunteers for the volunteers to then plant, and when people get there, you can perhaps tell them more about the peat restoration and the importance of peat. So somebody asked in the chat line, how are we sort of telling people about peat? There's multiple ways, and this is one of the ways of communicating, is actually talking to people as they're going up the hill. So I was at the bottom of the hill, and I was giving out cotton grass plugs in little bags that have got Pendle Hill Peat Repair on them. And as I was giving them out, I was telling people what it was and what I was wanting them to do, and would they be willing to carry the peat up to the top of the hill to give to Sarah and the volunteers. And for those of you that may not know, this is what cotton grass looks like. This is a cotton grass in flower on Pendle Hill. So I was giving out these bags, and people were really up for it. I had only, we sold out, so to speak, of the bags really, really quickly. Within an hour, they'd all gone. So another idea has arisen that we're going to actually do this as a participatory performance. And I'm going to be making bags, which will be visible bags, big white bags that will then hold the cotton grass. We had hoped that this might happen September time. We were sort of having this kind of, our plan was that it could happen, but of course Pendle's gone into a second lockdown. It's not looking like it's going to happen, but it will happen. This will actually happen at some point. We just don't know when. So the next available time would be next spring, which is what we're hoping for and what we'll work towards.
It was just such a brilliant icebreaker and conversation starter for me and for our volunteers to talk to people about the why are we doing this, what is the problem. And I guess it's a really nice feeling to be part of a solution, isn't it, to say, you know, it's only like, you know, but it's my little bit. And right at the beginning, Kerry was talking a little bit about the people wanting to make their mark on the top of the hill, and with the graffiti stones and their names and rude messages and less rude messages and whatever. But this is another way that hopefully we were tapping into that desire for people, for us as a species, to want to make our mark, but in a way that is actually complementing the peat restoration work that we've been doing already. Peat compost, it's a really, really important thing. Don't use peat compost. Find an alternative. But peat is milled from lowland peat areas, not from upland peat areas. So in terms of what can you do for the upland peat, what can we all do? We can stop using peat, because peat is peat wherever it comes from. But in terms of restoring and preventing damage from upland peat, stick to the paths where the paths available. That's what I would say, because human traffic and trampling, anything that damages the vegetation protects the peat underneath. So anything that makes a hole in the vegetation, the weather will then erode the peat out from underneath.
I don't know whether it's unexpected or not, but it might be. I mean, I'm an artist. That's how I describe what I do. And the one thing that I spend an awful lot of time doing, it's not creative at all, but I spend an awful lot of time reading scientific papers and research papers, reading about what other artists are doing, what other peat restoration work is happening. So much of my work, I don't know if it's unexpected, is actually research.
I would say just so sometimes it looks like is and some of the photos that we have, which I didn't show today, I always seem to be in the wind and the rain, is how much fun it actually is. And if you're kind of, once you're up there and you're kitted out, yeah, come and join us, come and do some planting, come and see what it's like. And the big diggers are great fun as well. So yeah, it's more fun than it looks. Go onto the Pendle Hill Landscape, I think it's called Pendle Hill Project website, and click on how to get involved, sign up to our volunteer newsletter, and meet us at the top.